Hello, I'm Naomi Firestone Teeter, and I'd like to welcome you here tonight on behalf of the Jewish Book Council to our program Soviet Roots American Branches, the final program in our 2015 literary series, Unpacking the Book, Jewish Writers and Conversation, hosted at the Jewish Museum. Our first two programs were truly enriching, and I have no doubt that tonight will be equally thought-provoking. Jewish Book Council is a not-for-profit dedicated to promoting the reading, writing, and publishing of books of Jewish interest. Find out more at jewishbookcouncil.org or pick up a rack card on your way out for a full list of JBC programs, awards, and publications. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to first ask that you silence or shut down your cell phones. I'd also like to give a special thanks to all of our sponsors for their support: the David Berg Foundation, the Jewish Museum, specifically Colin, Samuel, Ronya, and Will, the National Book Foundation, Genesis Philanthropy Group, and Tablet Magazine, an online publication dedicated to Jewish writing. I'm so grateful for everything each of our sponsors has done to help make this series such a success, and I look forward to future collaborations. And thank you to JBC staff, Carolyn Hessel, Nat Bernstein, Carol Kaufman, Mimi Frank, and Suzanne Swift for all their hard work to help make tonight possible. Following this evening's program, we welcome you to join us for a book sale, author signing, and reception. During the reception, we invite you to participate in Alina and Jeff Loomis's photography project From Selfie to Groupie, in which you'll be invited to think about questions related to Jewish identity. This will be in the back of the room, over on the right there, and you'll have the opportunity to purchase their new and beautiful book featuring past participants of the project. Plus, they'll even sign it for you. Please refer to the cards you received on your chairs for more information about the book and the project. During the reception, we also encourage you to visit the Jewish Museum exhibits, which will remain open throughout the reception. At 8 p.m., there will be a guided tour of the exhibit Revolution of the Eye, Modern Art and the Birth of American Television on the first floor, and the exhibit Repetition and Difference on the second floor. Both will begin at 8 p.m. Now for my final task. I'm pleased to introduce you to our series moderator, Bari Weiss, who has been a shining light throughout the entire season and is someone with whom I feel incredibly privileged to have worked. Bari Weiss is an associate book review editor at the Wall Street Journal. Before joining the book review, she worked as an op-ed editor at the Journal and continues to write regular profiles and op-eds for the page. For 2 years, Bari was a senior editor at Tablet Magazine, where she edited the site's political and news coverage. She's also written for Haaretz, The Forward, and the New York Sun. Be sure to look for Bari on New York One, where she talks about new books she likes on a segment called The Book Reader. Thank you so much, and enjoy the evening.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Before we get to the interesting stuff, one more logistical note. On your chairs are blank note cards. This is a Jewish event, so there will be a Q&A, but we're going to do it with a twist, which is that at the end of our discussion, we'll come around and we'll collect the note cards, and I'll choose some of the best ones to ask. Also, we're going to announce the winners of the book bundle, which I think Naomi just talked about. Okay, now I am thrilled to introduce these three wonderful people to my left, both literally and probably politically. Let's start with Gal. Gal Beckerman is the op-ed editor at The Forward. He was the longtime editor and staff writer at the Columbia Journalism Review and has written for the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Wall Street Journal, among other publications. His first book, When They Come For Us, We'll Be Gone, which is right up there, was published in September 2010. It was named one of the best books of the year by The New Yorker and received both the 2010 National Jewish Book Award and the 2012 Sammy Wara Prize for Jewish Literature. In addition to all these accolades, I want to publicly praise Gal for actually volunteering to review an 800-page book about Joseph Stalin's daughter, which you should look for in the journal. If that isn't dedication, I don't know what is. Please join me in welcoming Gal Beckerman. Yelena Akhtiorskaya published her first novel, Panic in a Suitcase, last summer. It was a National Book Award 5 Under 35 honoree and was on the New York Times notable list for 2014. She also writes stories, many of which have been published in N+1, and lives on the Upper West Side working on another book. I know her last name is hard to pronounce, but it's worth the effort and worth remembering. Please join me in welcoming Yelena. And finally, Boris Fishman. Boris was born in Belarus and immigrated to the US at 9. His journalism has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, and other publications. A Replacement Life is his first novel. It was selected by The New York Times as one of its 100 notable books of 2014. And in its front cover review, the writer said of Boris, "Is there room in American fiction for another brilliant young immigrant writer? There had better be, because here he is." Boris's second novel, Don't Let My Baby Do Rodeo, will come out next March. Please join me in welcoming this brilliant writer and dear friend, Boris Fishman. So since this is a talk called Soviet Roots, American Branches, I think the only appropriate note to start off on is a depressing one. And I thought that I would start with this 1977 essay by Irving Howe. He edited this anthology, which you guys may have seen, that was called Jewish American Stories, and it included works by all the big names, Philip Roth, Saul Bellow, Cynthia Ozick. And in his introduction to this book, he penned some lines that I think remain very relevant to this conversation, so bear with me, I'll read a few of them. "There remains the question worth asking, if impossible to answer with certainty. What is the likely future of American Jewish writing? Has it already passed its peak of achievement and influence? Can we expect a new generation of writers to appear who will contribute to American literature a distinctive sensibility and style derived from the Jewish experience in this country? My own view," he wrote, "is that American Jewish fiction has probably moved past its high point. Insofar as this body of writing draws heavily from the immigrant experience, it must suffer a depletion of resources, a thinning out of it. There just isn't enough. Other than in books and sentiment, there just isn't enough left of that experience." So there's no new Jewish literature, he's arguing, without this fresh experience of immigration. And I'm wondering if it's true, and if so, are you the last gasps of truly great American Jewish literature? Or is your work proof that maybe there's more left to dig into? We can start with Boris.
As long as Jews around the world continue to get persecuted and want to immigrate to America, the literature will continue to prosper and flourish.
Thank you, Vladimir Putin.
As the president of Russia, I'm doing my part to keep Jewish literature alive in America. But he's also right in that I think what he means is that American Jewish literature today gets most of its energy from Jewish immigrants and the religious experience. I don't know of a lot of assimilated American Jewish stories, lives that are making great literature. Can anyone correct me? I'm ready to be corrected.
Feel free to shout out audience members.
I mean, Jonathan Safran Foer had to go back to Ukraine. The one novel that he wrote about America wasn't very good. Nathan Englander in his best book, dealt with the religious experience predominantly, and so on and so forth. Nicole Krauss, maybe?
But even she had to go back.
She had to go back too. She deals with guys who are 80 years old, right? Is there anything happening in the secular American Jewish experience today that's vibrant enough to make for great literature? That's my question. Alice Hoffman? I don't know her.
He's not Jewish. No, I think everybody thinks
Dara
he
Horn.
is.
It's all. I mean, I feel like
Good example, although she's modern Orthodox, basically.
Right.
So, Yelena, do you want to comment?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's hard for me to say for myself because, I am an immigrant, so I don't know, what's going to happen in the future. I'm pretty sure if I have kids, they won't be writing interesting things, But...
oh, yes, they will, with a mama like you.
But that said, the most, well-known Jewish writers, Philip Roth and Saul Bellow, they weren't immigrants. Yeah, their time has passed, but they weren't immigrants.
Bellow was.
Bellow was. He wasn't born here.
But I mean, he was an immigrant from Canada.
That is
As
a
the
far,
president
far
of
away
Russia,
land
I
as far as
consider
I'm
America and
concerned.
Canada to be one country.
That also, when I read writers, I don't necessarily think are they Jewish or not. So it's hard for me to tell. Like, I'm pretty sure that there's great Jewish writers writing now. I just don't think that they're Jewish.
There are great Jewish writers writing now, they're just not Jewish, is what you said?
I don't know if they're Jewish. They might be. They could be writing on other themes, right? Isn't that possible?
Yes, I just want to make sure I understood what you were saying.
Yeah.
It's like what Malamud said, every man is a Jew, just some of them don't know it yet.
Or perhaps the most interesting writing happening along these lines is Israel, where there is, this constant influx of immigration still. Sorry, Gal, were you?
Well, I'm actually waiting for the Israeli-American immigrant novel. I think maybe that's another group that hasn't been exploited yet as as a source of.
They write about working in high tech, or
they repeat. They go through a lot of they experience the same kind of tensions that every immigrant group feels, and it's but it hasn't quite happened yet for that group. But
I was going to ask, why do each of you think that we're experiencing this? And lots of people have called it different things, the Beat generation, the boom, the wave, the whatever, of Jewish, Russian, American writing right now. Hal would say, and he goes on to say this in his essay, that a subculture finds its voice and its passion, he wrote, at exactly the moment that it approaches disintegration. So I'm wondering if you think that that's what's going on or not.
Well, I think it's several things. Number one, to be writing, you need to, I think, feel alienated, and you need to feel, at least kind of miserable and alone, and not like you're like in the center of things. So I guess that's, the case for Russian immigrants, or immigrants in general, being more prone to writing. But then the disintegration is true. It's like you write about something when you feel like it's the end. It's both like, the way the narrator is usually like, it's told in past tense. It's like, you write once it's over, once you're processing. So it's sort of the end. It's like, it's very sad. But in a way, like the Russian immigrant, it's looking back, and it's like, we're right at the end of it all.
I mean, most of the immigration took place in the late 70s, late 80s, early 90s.
Thankfully, we have an expert here that can correct
you
on
everything.
At least I can
do something here.
I was looking at you. And yeah, I feel like for the most part, unless you're someone like the rare exception, like someone like Alexander Hemin, who's not Russian, but was much older when a phenomenal writer who is from Bosnia, came here at a much older age and has become a phenomenal writer in English. But typically you have to be somewhere between 0 and like 15 or 17 during those years in order to be able to write about it. The older generation was just too old to. And so we are coming of age. We're getting into the writing age now. Exactly, our children will be.
They'll have nothing to say.
They'll have nothing to say. But we have a lot to say because we grew up in that place, which was messed up in a way that makes living very difficult, but it's very productive for creative work. And we grew up under people who were shaped by that place, and that gift keeps on giving to this day.
I think you call them in the book the walking wounded.
The walking wounded, yeah. That's who they are. They're trauma victims. But the moments you talk, it's where luck meets opportunity or whatever. The opportunity is we do have an assist from Mr. Putin in that he does his best to keep Russia in the headlines. And Russia declines to make itself any more understandable or explicable than it was during the Soviet period. People continue to be as mystified by it as they used to be, and they keep wanting to try to understand. So they pick up these books partly in an effort to do that. But that may never end, but our piece of it may. And I feel like we've already written the story once. Are you working on a second novel? Yeah. Is it like heavy-duty Russian? No. My second novel is called Don't Let My Baby Do Rodeo. Half of it takes place in Montana. And it's not about Russians in Montana, So I think that story can only be told once.
But it can only be told once, but that sense of alienation, the kind of the thing that you pulled out of being either an immigrant or the child of immigrants, that's a quality that you're infusing into fiction in general? I mean, because I'm very curious about this question, because there are, immigrant writers, they write the first book, which is kind of like semi-autobiographical, that captures their own experience growing up in these households that were so different from what they saw around them. And then it's like, what's next? And then, maybe the next book has a little bit of that element. And I mean, it's a pattern that one sees. And then, but what is that like? What is that more essential extraction? Because that might be kind of a more positive way of looking at the effect more generally on literature. Of not just like people can write about this direct experience they had, but there's something about being an immigrant that kind of gives them a certain...
You said it. I think the key word is alienation. And as long as you manage to have some experience that alienates you from the mainstream, you're good to go. As long as you're not in the center, I feel worse for Christian white males, because they have the hardest time producing great literature. They're in the center of it all. But as long as you're gay or a woman or African American, like you've got the tools.
Before we get too deep into identity politics, which we can get back to along with Putin, let's hear a little bit about each of your books. And Gal, let's start with you.
Okay, I'm the odd man out here as the nonfiction.
Right. So describe the book a little bit, and then read a passage. Yeah.
So my book is basically the history of the Soviet Jewry movement, starting in the early 1960s, and people don't often kind of associate the Soviet Jewry movement with something that started quite that early, going until the end of the Cold War, really. And it's a book that kind of straddles both what was happening in the Soviet Union, in this underground and eventually not so underground movement that built up of dissidents, kind of challenging the regime to let them immigrate. And also the grassroots movement that built up here in the States that put quite a bit of pressure on the US government and turned this movement into like a real kind of issue in the Cold War. But there's lots of stories and lots of people, and it's told in a very kind of narrative way. That's the pitch.
It's an incredible book. So can you read a passage from the book for us that will give us a sense of the theme or one of your characters?
I'm just going to start from the beginning.
Okay. Great.
Yosef Mendelevich was 16 when he saw the killing grounds for the first time. It was the fall of 1963. He had heard about the place just outside of Riga, in the vast woods of tall fir trees and sprawling brush that the locals called Rumbuli. All one had to do was follow the train tracks east toward Moscow. There, underneath the black soil in 5 narrow ditches, lay 25,000 bodies, Jewish bodies, killed by the Nazis and their Latvian collaborators in 10 days at the end of 1941. Mendelevich knew this, all the Jews of Riga did, and they knew too about a small group of Jews, Zionists they were calling themselves, who had searched the year before under the dark shadow of those trees for the exact place of the massacre. In the end, it hadn't been so hard to find. Poking out of the earth were fragments of charred bone, the shriveled brown leather of a child's shoe, a broken Star of David on a necklace. Mendelevich was a shy, withdrawn boy with pale, pimply skin and thick horn-rimmed glasses. Most days when he wasn't in school, he was alone inside his parents' house in a poor section of Riga. The outside world entered mainly through its brutal noises, the shouts of his Latvian neighbors stumbling home full of vodka, glass breaking, drunken fathers beating their children. Like any sensitive teenage introvert, he found his home, his only comfort, in his imaginings. In Yosef's case, the world he escaped to in his mind was a real place, though a rather fantastical destination for a young Soviet boy. It was a country so far away, so obscured and unknown, it might as well have existed under a different sun. That place was Israel. And he constructed his idea of it with what he had at hand. His Aunt Fanya, one of the rare Soviet citizens allowed to immigrate in the late 50s, had once sent a color postcard of a swimming pool in Kfar Giladi, a kibbutz in the northern Galilee. Mendelevich took a magnifying glass to it, counting all the people, scrutinizing the shape and shade of every tree. The sight of so many Jews gathered together wearing swimming trunks seemed unreal. Fanya had also written his family a letter in which she recounted the history of the one-armed Joseph Trumpeldor and his last stand at Tel Chai, not far from Kfar Giladi, where he was killed in 1920 while defending the settlement from local Arabs. He became a legend for his famous dying words, "Never mind, it's good to die for our country." At night, Mendelevich's father would tune their shortwave radio to Kol Israel, the voice of Israel, and hold the receiver close to his ear, translating the news from Hebrew to Russian. Before the war, his father had studied in a cheder, a Jewish religious school, and so he understood the language. But to Mendelevich, the sounds were unfamiliar. A mystical, warm tongue from a better place, one he knew little about, but felt, even as a teenager, that he was destined to go to.
Thank you. And just because Gal is the... other than me, we are both not Russian, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what drew you to writing this history.
Oh, absolutely. Well, there's the schmaltzy reason that I give sometimes when I'm interviewed about the book, which is that the Soviet Jewry movement, for somebody growing up in America, my parents are Israeli, but I grew up in America, in Los Angeles, and the Soviet Jewry movement growing up in the 80s was always kind of on the periphery of my awareness. And so, like a lot of American Jews growing up at that time, I had a Soviet twin. And when I was 13, when I had my bar mitzvah, I don't know how many of you remember or know about this program. Many people do. It was to kind of paired up American Jewish boys and girls with maybe unaware Soviet Jewish boys and girls who could not have their bar mitzvah. But anyways, the seed was planted then.
Do you remember his name?
Of course, Maxim Yankelevich. And there's actually a very funny story, which I don't have time to tell, where I found him while I was on tour with the book because somebody because I mentioned him at some point in the book in the introduction, and somebody afterwards came up to me and said, "I know Maxim." I said, he said, "No, I know. He works in software in New Jersey." And I was like, "What?" And it turns out indeed that was the kid that I was sending letters to when I was 13. But the more probably accurate reason for why I spent a big chunk of my life working on this book was that I had a real kind of intellectual fascination with two kind of questions. One was how the American and American Jewish and kind of Soviet Jewish communities overcame the scars of World War II. It occurred to me that following the war, American Jews were very kind of psychologically scarred by this perception that they had of themselves as being passive and not having done enough to help European Jewry during the war. I felt like Soviet Jewry, the movement was a kind of, even more than Israel, I think, was a way that they kind of cleansed themselves of that feeling. And Soviet Jews, of course, had this kind of physical scar running the length of the Iron Curtain, where they were cut off from world Jewry, they were cut off from their own history. And so I wanted to understand kind of what happened during this, what seemed to me kind of a gray period in my historical knowledge of kind of how they came from being those communities after the war to the communities that I knew today. And the other question was kind of a more universal question of human rights and how human rights kind of gained such a central place in American foreign policy. And I came to understand that Soviet Jewry movement was a really key factor in how that happened. So those were the kind of two questions that I was seeking to answer. And then on top of that, once I started looking into it, it was just a good story. Just lots of really wonderful characters and plot and all the things that that my novelist friends would appreciate as the makings of good narrative. So,
Thanks, Gal.
I just want to add that you're also the odd man out in that you're an inversion of the subject for this talk. You're American roots Soviet branches. And I think the next Russian and Soviet stories will be told by Americans rather than Russians. I have an American friend who's writing his second novel about the Soviet space program. That's what's consuming to him, and I know quite a few people working on works like that. And I think that place is going to, especially as it recedes, is going to fire the imagination of non-Jewish Americans or Jewish Americans, perhaps far more than even the people who came from there.
It's interesting because that generation that came of age, like when I did, the 80s was this moment of real fascination with what was happening over there, and you have TV shows like The Americans and so, there is something that is kind of triggering that interest.
Yeah.
Yelena, can you tell us about your book and read something from it?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm really bad at summarizing things and giving the short version. I think it took like 2 years just to figure out what to put on the back. But so maybe what I'll do is I'm just gonna set up the part that I'm gonna read, and then then it'll make sense. So the Nasmertov family moved from Odessa to Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. in the immigration, and they left behind Pasha, who's an uncle, a poet. He didn't move with them, and he's still thinking sort of about whether he wants to move to America or not. Eventually, he decides to stay, and I guess that's sort of the premise of the book. And he converts to Christianity. So the family is Jewish, and he's the one who converts to Christianity. And the part that I'm going to read is when he's here, he's in Brighton Beach, and his mom asks him to take off his cross. Okay. Oh, and his mom is dying of breast cancer. What is this? Esther took this moment to corner her son. Her damp face gave off a postmenopausal odor like overripe apricot flesh. The sweat never had time to dry. And like flypaper, it caught everything it came into contact with: hairs, lint, fruit flies. Pasha, she said, can I ask a tiny favor? Please don't get angry. Just try to hear me out. A bit of patience. Out with it, Pasha said. Take that thing off. Oh, not this again. Just while you're here. For Frida's sake. Frida's his 9-year-old niece. She's 9. But she's a curious girl. She'll start asking questions, and next thing you know, she's running off to join a convent. It's not impossible. She still occasionally makes the sign of the cross over herself. And that's my fault? Is it so much to ask, Pasha? Would it be so difficult? He looked to the side as if consulting the couch. He thought that the combination of circumstances, the separation, his mother's condition, the palliative effect of time, would have finally rendered this a non-issue. Wishful thinking. His conversion was bound to remain an open wound on the family flesh, susceptible to infection. At 20, he'd inflicted the injury. There had been the technicality of the process, an elaborate theater of spite, as Esther called it, convinced that every step of it was being done to undo her. The catechumen period had been auspiciously brief. The priest practically apologized on God's behalf, as if Pasha's soul had ended up in the yid pile by accident, in a forgetful or clumsy moment. He received the Eucharist like a crying toddler slipped a pacifier. At last, he was spiritually content. He wore a conspicuous, though not garish, silver crucifix around his neck. It was later tucked into t-shirts. He attended services, believed in creationism, had convincing arguments and logical proofs against Darwin's theory, which had the quality of withering immediately in the convinced person's brain and being impossible to paraphrase. And he collected icons. The icons weren't just any old icons. Rather, they were very, very old icons, obtained after hours of sifting through junk, under the junk owner's suspicious stare and briny breath, plucked from the heaps of vendors who had no clue they possessed anything of worth and wouldn't have believed it if you told them. The Soviet Union's skewed ratio of valuable objects to discerning collectors resulted in Pasha's acquiring a reputation for clutter. Correction, domestic chaos. Someone was usually around to provide the reproaching. One evening, he came home holding a tiny wooden panel with chipped, blackened paint in which he claimed to see the Virgin of Kazan. At least 200 years old, he said, trembling. 10 kopecks. After months of painstaking restoration, the Black Lady materialized for everyone to see. But not all instances were so exemplary.
Thank you. So you grew up in, I'm going to ask you the obvious question, but can you tell us why you wrote this book and how close you are to Frida, who's kind of the other main protagonist other than Pasha? It's his niece.
His niece, who came to America when she was 7, like me. and then became, a mess of an adult like me. Very close, very close. I mean, well, this is the thing. It's like, okay, this is what it's kind of difficult because everybody always asks, how autobiographical is it, obviously. And then also people say, your first book is autobiographical, but then, you can really become a writer. And I don't think that's true. I think that it's all, at least as far as I can see, as I'm slowly trying to, become a writer, it's all autobiographical. Even if you're making it up, nothing is made up. It's all autobiographical. And so this book, yes, it's so many things are based on my family. It's based on my experience. It's very close, but it's still, I don't know. It's still fiction. It's still so much of it is still not real.
Was it harder for your family to read?
Yeah, it was traumatic. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. We can get more into that later.
No, but I think, they like trauma. They feed on it. I was...
Well, I read in an interview you gave that you grew up in a building where the co-op fights would descend into bloody, actual physical fist fights.
No, absolutely. Okay. Yeah. And my mom is board president.
We're getting a glimpse of the kind of parent you're going to be in this talk, and I'm really enjoying it. Okay, Boris, how about you? Read, explain briefly what the book's about.
The book is it's about a young man, a failed writer, who starts forging Holocaust restitution claims for old Russian Jews in Brooklyn. This part is not autobiographical. I feel compelled to explain. I agree with Yelena in that even the hardcore autobiographical stuff is never autobiographical because real life does not work the way that drama works. Drama has entirely different requirements. And so if you transcribed real life without major adjustments, characters would not work. It would be leaden. It would be really boring. And so it is, right, even the most distant seeming things are very autobiographically inspired, but even the most autobiographical seeming things are actually quite distant from what really happened, for what it's worth. So I'm going to read, right? Yeah, I'm going to read. Slava, the young man, his grandmother passes away. She was a Holocaust survivor, and her invitation to apply for restitution has just arrived in the mail, and she's gone and died. And his grandfather says, well, why don't you write the claim anyway? And Slava says, but she's gone. And his grandfather says, don't write it about her. And Slava, naive Slava, says, about whom then? And the grandfather says, write it about me. And the grandfather says, Slava says, but you were evacuated to safety. And the grandfather says, you're a writer, aren't you? Until now, it's been a source of great shame for the grandfather that Slava is a writer. Whenever they encounter someone together, the grandfather says he's a PhD student at Harvard. But all of a sudden, Slava's writerly disposition has become useful. And the grandfather is a character who likes useful things and people. So that should set up. And the family is called the Gelmans. Now he was a writer. Who was responsible for this deviancy in the first place? In America, unlike back home, the mail came down like a blizzard. The adults hauled it upstairs with dark faces. Was this a letter from Secretary of State James Baker III, alerting the Gelmans that a tragic mistake had been made and the family would have to return to the Soviet Union after all? They couldn't read it. The letter was given to Slava. His fingers were small enough for the Bible font and the onion skin pages of the brick dictionary that the Gelmans had procured from a curbside, somebody who'd learned English already. As the adults shifted their feet, leaning against door jambs and working their lips with their teeth, he carefully sliced open the envelope and unfolded the letter inside, his heart beating madly. He was all that stood between his family, and expulsion by James Baker III. America was a country where you could have Roman numerals after your name, like a Caesar. As the adults watched, Slava checked the unfamiliar words in the Brictionary. Annual percentage rate, layaway, installment plan, one time only, for special customers like you. The senior Gelman's waiting, Slava was embarrassed to discover himself mindlessly glued to certain words in the dictionary that had nothing to do with the task at hand. On the way to credit card, he had snagged on cathedral. It spires, T-H-D-L, like the ones the Gelmans had seen in Vienna en route to America. Rebate took him to roly-poly, which rolled around his mouth like a fat marble. Venture rewards led him to Zaftig, a Russian baba's breasts covering his eyes as she placed in front of him a bowl of morning farina. Eventually, he managed to verify enough to reassure the adults that, no, it didn't seem like a letter from James Baker III. The senior Gelmans sighed, shook their heads, resumed frying fish. Slava remained with the Brictionary. Hinky, lunker, waddles. Taro, terrazzo, toodaloo. Levity became a Jewish word because Levy was a Jewish surname. Had, knock, knock, was a door. A gewgaw was a gimcrack, and a gimcrack was folderol. Sententious could mean two opposite things, and was not to be confused with senescent, tendentious, or sentient, nor eschatological with scatological. This language placed the end of the world 2 letters away from the end of a bowel movement. Russian words were as stretchy as the meat under grandmother's arm. You could invent new endings, and they still made sense. Like peasants fidgeting with their ties at a wedding, the words wanted to unlace into diminutives. Mikhail into Mishenka, little Misha. Kartoshka into Kartoshechka, little potato. English was colder, clipped, a brain game. But English was brilliant. Thank you.
Boris, the epigraph to your book says, all writing is revenge. And I'm wondering who you were avenging in writing this book.
In my own small way, I was avenging all the people who did not get to tell their stories because they were murdered. But that's sort of a grand task for one novel. I was simply trying to propose that, though by the way it's notable that that epigraph comes from a Cuban poet, you know? But also I was trying to propose that just because that revenge taken in fiction is more significant than it seems, and it's more real than it might imagine itself to be. After a reading once, a young woman came up to me and said, you know, because Slava's grandmother dies before he's had a chance to learn anything about what she went through during the war. And part of the reason he agrees to forge these claims is to sort of invent on the page a woman that he never got to know in real life. And so this young woman came up to me and said, you know what, I did what Slava does in the novel. My grandparents died before I got a chance to learn anything about them. But you know, we all have shreds of family lore, and I took them and I read a couple of history books and I combined it all, and I invented stories, plausible stories about what my grandparents may have gone through. And I know they're false, but they give me a great deal of comfort anyway. And by the way, you can imagine these false stories over the game of telephone that happens as the generations go by, becoming the true history of what this family went through during World War II. And we know they're invented, but considering the emotional and psychological import they're going to have for those descendants, I personally don't care. And so I wanted to propose that fiction presents an opportunity to live lives that never got to be lived for a variety of reasons in real life. And the other reason simply was this novel is a giant FU to all the people who said no to it on its way to during its gestation. So it's extremely satisfying for that reason as well.
I've read this Saul Bellow line that was reprinted that he said in 1988 that I kind of wanted you guys to respond to, that I really liked. He said, "In my first consciousness, I was, among other things, a Jew, a child of Jewish immigrants. At home, our parents spoke Russian to each other. We children spoke Yiddish with them. We spoke English with one another. At the age of 4, we began to read the Old Testament in Hebrew. We observed Jewish customs, some of them superstitious, and we recited prayers and blessings all day long. Because I had to memorize most of Genesis, my first consciousness was that of a cosmos, and in that cosmos, I was a Jew. I suppose it would be proper to apply the word archaic to such a representation of the world as I had, archaic, prehistoric. This was my given, and it would be idle to quarrel with it, to try and revise or efface it. To turn away from those origins, however, has always seemed to me an utter impossibility. It would be a treason to my first consciousness to un-Jew myself." And I'm wondering if you all, as writers, perhaps beginning with Gal or Yelena, if you ever kind of struggled with that before you arrived at writing these very kind of particularly Jewish books, you know, trying to write something that would maybe appeal more broadly and be universal. Or and this reminds me of a line you've talked about this also in your book, kind of Cynthia Ozick metaphor of the shofar.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of kind of Jewish writers struggle with that question of understanding that their experience of the world comes in large part from being Jewish in the broadest sense of whatever that means, but they don't want to necessarily be pigeonholed that way, or categorized or put on a shelf as just being a Jewish writer. I think for me, my book gave me a great opportunity as I saw it, because the movement itself that I was writing about had this particularist element to it, which was largely Jews helping other Jews, but it was also a movement about human rights, a movement about the state of the Cold War. It was so, through writing about this movement that actually embodied this kind of synthesis of the particularistic and the universal, I felt like I was able to do that too, write from a place probably of passion about an issue that mattered to me. I can't deny it, because I'm Jewish and because I had a connection to it, but also to write about things that I hoped would kind of resonate more broadly in the way that the movement resonated more broadly beyond just helping Jews.
Yeah, and I think there's a kind of a lovely connection between this movement, which is just so particular and tribal in its way, and yet resonated, as a human story. And I think that's maybe what you're looking for when you want readers to respond to your books. Like, yes, it's a story about this particular family in South Brooklyn or Brighton Beach, but yet it's about any family in a certain sense.
Yeah, but you can never know whether what's going to resonate and what's not going to resonate. I didn't worry about the Jewish aspects of it, because I don't feel like this is a particularly Jewish book. I mean, in a way, like the Russian Jews are like the savage Jews, because they're just like savages. They don't. They're Jews, but they have never gone. Most of them, the community that I know, they don't go to synagogue. They don't know the first thing about Jewish law. They don't, maybe they'll have a bar mitzvah, but that's rare. So I wasn't thinking that what I was worried about was more writing, the particular Russian Brighton Beach thing, and the pigeonholing that comes from that, and that's not going to be universal. I did worry about that, but that was the time when I was also thinking that to be universal, I had to, encompass like other planets and, have it just, have it be in the whole universe. And when I was writing science fiction, because in a way, science fiction is the most universal kind of literature. It's literally universal. So when I decided that I was not going to be a science fiction master, that was when I was like, okay, I can write about my little tiny spot. And in a way, that's kind of what like even quantum physics tells you, like the little tiny spot is sort of as big, you know, as like the largest.
That was profound. I could stop.
I've been reading a lot of quantum physics.
What have you been reading?
I know. Well, actually, I've been reading, and I find this profoundly disturbing, and this has completely warped I think it's actually driving me to insanity. I've been reading about how the universe is a hologram.
Where are you reading this?
No, it's actually, like, wait another 20 years, this is going to be hard fact. Our universe is a hologram.
You heard it here first, guys.
Wait, do you not know? You have not read this?
No, but I don't read about quantum physics, honestly.
No.
Or whatever this is.
Have you not read this?
This is really going into territories that I wasn't expecting, and I'm thrilled. So go on, and I challenge you to bring it back to Soviet roots, American branches.
A lot of Soviets were physicists.
Nice.
That's true.
There you go.
But that's base level. Let's go deeper than that. No, seriously. Do you want to tell us about the hologram thing, or what
Oh,
we got?
I mean, no. Of course, I want to talk about the hologram thing. I think it's absolutely huge. And actually, the more that you think about it, the more that you realize that it makes sense. Everything is happening basically on 2 dimensions, and it's being projected into the hologram that is this universe. We're all a hologram.
Boris, would you like to respond to that? Come on, you can riff.
It's a hard act to follow. My novel works on 2 levels.
Like a hologram.
Like a hologram.
Just bring it back to yourself. That always works.
The one thing I wanted to say about what you said was that for a variety of reasons, I wanted to make my second novel as un-Jewish as possible. And so I think the word Jewish or Jew appears in it literally no more than 3 times. But then someone read it and they pointed out to me that it's a lot more Jewish than you think. And so some ineffable something translated into the work without my control over it. And that's really a great rebuke to anyone who says that the Jewishness of Soviet Jews is lightly worn, just because it isn't religiously based, as mine is not. And that's intriguing to me and kind of mysterious because I don't know what that kind of Jewishness is, and to try to diagnose it and quantify it. I mean, you know, it's the history, it's the humor, it's the food, but it must be something more as well that I'm not quite sure what it is. I mean, the best way to test it is to say, what are you going to teach your kids when you have them? That's really the best question of it. But I think it's with you more than you want it to be. At least it was in my case, and sort of I'm curious to find out as I write what that particular attachment is.
But I think it's interesting how all of you kind of, and this has come up in the other panels as well, kind of have this approach of like, you know, like this apologetic. Like, why is it not a point of pride to be a Jewish writer?
It's very simple. Like, you as a writer, your ego is vast, and you want to write for the universe. So anyone who says, oh, you're a Russian writer, oh, you're a Jewish writer, I mean, American
But it's
writer.
like saying you're a female person. I mean, it just is.
Well, that depends what being a Jewish writer means. I mean, like, I don't, you know, one can write about a family and it's a Jewish family and not mention the word Jew, and they never do anything that's recognizably Jewish, but they're Jewish. Like, there's something about the sensibility. Like, you know, Yelena, when I was reading your book, like, that family, they didn't have to light the Shabbat candles to seem to me like different than like a non-Jewish Russian family. Like, there was something that felt recognizably Jewish about them. Like, so I think that sensibility kind of leaks in ways that that don't have to do with the outward trappings of it.
Barry, do you have a problem with the designation woman writer?
It's factual. No, I don't.
But it's often deployed in, perhaps unconsciously so, but it's often deployed in a parochializing way.
But I think what's interesting is going back to the identity politics that kind of came up in the beginning. You're like, you're black, you're Native American, you're queer, own it. Like, that's your ticket in, and yet you're kind of shirking it as well. It's like you want it both ways.
I mean,
Yes.
Okay.
But I
calling
guess
that
what I was trying to say before was that the implication of being a woman writer does that mean that you're writing only about women or about topics that relate to women, or that the fact that you are a woman is somehow that sensibility is infused in the fiction that you produce? You could write a book that only has men in it, but you're a woman writer because and would you feel pigeonholed? So
I guess when I hear woman writer, I simply hear writer with a female body. That is what I hear.
And I think the fear of the pigeonholing is not that you're a writer who might have a Jewish sensibility, who writes about everything, and like you just happen to be Jewish. I think the fear is the fear of the pigeonholing is that people assume that you're going to write about something that is, parochially Jewish. That feels small.
Right. To be less flippant about my answer, the two things that I wanted to ask with my novel are the law and justice always the same thing? Which obviously the answer is no. And how much distance does there have to be between them before we're authorized to take matters into our own hands as individuals? And how do you honor elders whose definition of honor is different from yours? For me, these are universal questions that are strongly relevant for Jews, but
Right.
I hope for them to be relevant.
Or
to
they
other-
might be questions, that they might feel like Jewish questions to some.
And I have absolutely no problem with them being appropriated as Jewish questions. And I mean, you could check my appearance calendar. 75% of it is in front of Jewish audiences, and proudly so. But my intent was not to ask Jews what they think about that question. My intent was to ask human beings what they think about that question. I got a letter from a woman in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, who files restitution claims on behalf of the Lakota Sioux. I mean, that was really important to me.
Maybe that's what it is. It's the audience that you don't want to feel like you're limiting, that somehow restricting yourself. And I think someone would feel like that if they were called a woman writer.
I don't think it has to do with the audience.
What does it have to do with?
Well, okay, I think it's...
And also, how do you respond to woman writer? I'm just curious.
Strangely, I haven't heard woman writer. Yeah, I think I would not respond very well. Woman writer. No, I wouldn't respond well. I don't...
We won't call you that then.
Growl. Okay, sorry. Anyway, what were you going to say?
I do. It's not because of audience. I do bristle. I have to admit that I do bristle when it's like, oh, Jewish writer, or I bristle against it for I think and Russian writer too. It's just because it's like it's coming from the outside. It's like when you're writing, you're just writing whatever the hell you're writing, and then somebody tells you what you are, and it's never good to be told what you are. You always just want to be like everything. You feel like you're everything. But that said, like I have no problem where like if whoever reads something will read it for whatever the hell they get out of it. I don't know. Okay, but that said, I do feel kind of like being a Russian Jew. I have like not a feeling of inferiority, but like something to, American Jews who actually, have gone to yeshiva or, whatever, or do know what it means to be Jewish. And I feel kind of like a fraud, actually. I think maybe that is a part of it. Like, I feel like a fraud. I have no idea, what really makes me Jewish, like other than that my mom is Jewish. I don't know, I feel like I don't know enough,
Can I just ask a question of both of you, or also you? Or I guess of you, because you feel diminished and boxed in by the title. Do you have the same problem with being referred to as an American writer? Yeah, neither do I, right?
Of course.
And the question is why? There's something non-parochial about being American that there is about being, right?
Can the Jewish Book Council folks go around and collect the cards with questions? So if you have a question and you want it to be read, please give it to Naomi or Nat or Suzanne. They're going to come around now. In the meantime...
Can I say one more thing?
Yes.
I understand that I'm...
Yes.
that I have to be protected from answering.
You male writer.
It is also inarguable that Soviet Jews labor under a real sense of inferiority by virtue of being Jewish, not even relative to American, not even next to American Jews, just at least in my case, there's a real subconscious self-loathing thing that comes from having been a Soviet citizen and having grown up under Soviet parents, and there's no argument about that.
But I think what's interesting is thinking about some of the
I
characters.
don't feel that.
Thinking of some of the characters in Gall's book, like people that, you know, like I can't imagine, like I'm trying to picture Natan Sharansky sitting in this room and hearing you say, like, I don't want to be identified as a Jewish Russian writer, and that generation being like, you ingrate. Like, we were willing to die for you to be able to be that.
But there's something else. I think I disagree with you, Boris. I think that, I mean, the feeling of inferiority, if it's there, it's there. Like, but the sense of identity for Soviet Jews came from something that was much more kind of a purely ethnic identity. Was you were outsiders together. There was this, you know, it wasn't a function of everyone doing the same rituals or everyone going to Hebrew school. It was like something almost more organic to the experience of being like an outsider and feeling like a sense of community with other people who were, you know, not allowed certain things. It was kind of all kinds of unspoken stuff that, and that to me feels like a stronger connection in some ways. I mean, it might not be a sustainable source of identity, because once you don't have the outside pressures, like what's to actually keep it going? Whereas you can keep sending your kids to Hebrew school, but the identity itself, even if you don't acknowledge it, or even if it doesn't have the kind of these very obvious things that you can point to, is actually like a very cohesive identity.
Totally, and you can use outsiderdom as a source of strength, or you could use it as a source of self-consciousness. And I was speaking primarily about the environment in which I grew up, where this kind of outsiderdom and the way that Jewishness was stigmatized in the Soviet Union really had a deep psychological impact on my immediate family, and I think it trickled through to myself. And for me, it's very much an ongoing process to tunnel deep enough to where that lives and to try to excavate it and get rid of it. And it's still with me. That, with me, is what I was saying. I wasn't speaking for Soviet Jews, though the Soviet Jews I know, it's true for all of them. It's true for all of them.
Yeah.
But these people were not refuseniks.
Okay, some questions. Have you noticed any patterns or differences between audiences in their reactions to your book? Do you find that Jewish readers or Russian readers, older, younger readers respond distinctly? And if so, how? You can choose to answer that or not. Gal? I'm curious.
No, I was actually going to say something that connects, I think, a bit with some of the stuff that Boris has been,
Yeah, that's fine.
and with Boris's book. No, in response to that question.
Good.
Which is that I was very self-conscious myself about bringing this book to Russian audiences. You know, that there would be like that I would be seen as not being authentic enough, and that like how could you possibly write this book? And one of the things that I was really surprised and gratified by was that I found again and again this experience of Russian audiences feeling like I was validating their experience of being living in the Soviet Union, but also their immigration experience in a way that hadn't been, that they had felt overshadowed by, the Holocaust, and the place that has in American Jewish life, and even just the struggles of absorption of like actually making a place for themselves in America. That like they didn't feel like they had any right to like claim their stories as like important historical narratives. And so people would come up to me, and again, I don't think this is any compliment to like my writing, or the book, but people would come up to me like crying afterwards. I'd had this experience again and again, saying like, wow, like for the first time I get to actually like have somebody else reflect back to me that I lived through something that was an important thing.
Yeah, Russian Jews are often seen as aloof or distant or uninterested in getting involved, which is assumed to mean some kind of high-handedness or just a lack of interest in things of great import that Natan Sharansky suffered for, etc. The truth is that they're just really embarrassed and self-conscious. They feel like they don't know and they don't understand. And they really are, to my mind, trauma victims. And they feel extremely self-conscious about their history. and extremely unconfident about their ability to communicate about it. And so, sure, I can
It's not
easily...
surprising.
Yeah, I can easily imagine that confronted. But you're saying that you actually had Russian-speaking audiences?
Many, yeah.
I've had none. Because perhaps this is a story.
Actually, I was at a synagogue about 2 weeks ago where I showed up and they were like, "This is going to be in Russian, right?" I was like, "No."
Boris, why do you think that there have been none?
Why?
Two reasons. One is that the Russians in South Brooklyn, I don't think, read in English that much. Secondly, the book tries to hold up a mirror to my community and say, how much longer can we live this way? Which is to say, fraudulently. We're 25 years out of that country. It's time to give up those ways of living. I don't know how many people want to hear that message. Also, maybe they're not responding to it because there's nothing new here. They live among this every day. And so there's no news here for them. Interestingly, American Jews respond to it in a way that's curious for me as well, because I really meant to provoke and offend with the subject of this book. I wanted to write a different kind of Holocaust story, a Holocaust story that humanizes Jews by portraying them not as victims, but as sinners, because they are, and they deserve to live not because they were saints, but because they were sinners, and just like the rest of us. But to my amazement, American Jews have not been provoked or offended by this book at all, because they don't read it as a book about them. They read it as a book about Russian Jews, those savage others who live in a different way. And that's been so interesting to me to observe.
Do you think other immigrant writers like Junot Diaz have the same sense of inferiority as you do? I think it's a good question.
You have to ask him.
Okay.
I would
Yelena?
say yeah. Well, first of all, his books are so tough, he's always trying to be so cool and tough in his books. Like, where does that come from? Obviously, he's trying to prove something. So, and I have heard him talk, and I think he's known to be just, kind of an asshole. So I'm sure that comes from inferiority.
I just want to say I'm unhappy with the takeaway that's seeming to form that there's real dislike of being lumped in with or classified as a Jewish writer. That is not true, and it's a much more nuanced and subtle issue. I never hide the fact that I'm Jewish, even if I'm in the hardcorest sort of Arab or Muslim environment. I make a point of not concealing that I'm Jewish. It's something that I wear with pride, but it's a complicated identity that was imposed on me by virtue of the fact that my people come from that terrible, terrible place. And so it's something I struggle with and navigate on a spectrum. But it would be incorrect to say that I am embarrassed of being Jewish. I'm unhappy to be classified as a Jewish writer. Disappointed to be invited to explicitly Jewish events.
That's not what I heard in that question.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure, because that's important.
Yeah, no, I think with that question, at least the way I read it, is there seems to be among Jews, as opposed to other minority writer groups, more of a sense of apologetics than pride. That is what I heard in that question.
Are we self-hating? That's the question, I think.
Yeah, or are we self-hating or like a little strong, but yeah. Yeah, Yelena, did you want to say something?
Oh no, I'm just I'm thinking. I mean, self-hating. Yeah, that I take pride in.
Savage pride. What writers most influenced your writing? And I'll add to that, what books would you recommend to people here?
I feel like I can answer for you.
Do it.
Can I do it? Malamud, #1, the best. Well, I think that he's great. Actually, it took me a long time to realize that he's good. For a long time, I didn't realize, but I agree, and he's definitely influenced you very much.
Nice. And Boris, can you answer for Yelena?
Of course. Danielle Steele was very...
A woman writer.
A woman writer. Have you heard of her?
No, seriously.
Seriously.
You've been on enough panels with her. Can you answer it or no?
Actually, no,
Okay.
you probably can't.
Okay.
You don't know.
Yelena, you answer for yourself.
Well, I feel like I have to give like.
This is the first panel where Yelena has said more than 2 things. You guys have really brought something out of her. This is very, very impressive.
And she's talked about the universe being a hologram.
A hologram.
Like, let that be remembered.
This is
tonight.
big news, right? And I'm glad that I can bring it to you. Well, no. So the compliment to Malamud is because do you like his novels or his short stories more? Because
Both.
I like his short stories. So I really like Leonard Michaels. His short stories. I mean, he only wrote one novel, The Men's Club, which was really bad. But the short stories are incredible. So I think that I read him like basically almost every day. I don't know. And right now I'm reading The Golden Notebook. I was saying I've never read The Golden Notebook before, and it's wonderful.
By Doris Lessing.
Gal, yes. I was, as someone who tries to do journalism, I was blown away by how epic this book was and how you managed to tie together. You told an enormous story, like a 2-decade story with very specific characters. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about like when you started off. Like, it's more of a process question, actually.
Right,
like,
right.
how did you organize something this
Right.
vast?
Well, I always say that the hardest part about kind of structuring this book was casting it like a director casts a film, because you, in order for it to work together, as something that lasts almost, 2.5 decades and goes between the Soviet Union and the United States, in order for a reader to like maintain interest, there has to be characters who will be like these needles that you can use to thread through the story. Is that the right metaphor? Yeah.
It worked.
Yes. And so a big part of the job early on was just finding who those people were, and they weren't necessarily the Natan Sharanskys. They were, so this guy, Yosef Mendelevich, who I read to you the first few sentences of the paragraphs of the book, he ends up being this this character who is like this, the Zelig of this movement, in that he's just everywhere, and allowed me to kind of connect a bunch of different moments that I wanted to write about. So he's there in Riga when the movement starts. He's part of this Leningrad hijacking, which is like, that was the funnest chapter to write. It was a group of Soviet Jews in Riga and Leningrad who decided to hijack a plane and fly it out of the Soviet Union. They get caught, and you'll have to read the book to find out what happens. But I was able to, you could write that like a noir, basically. It was a lot of fun to write. And then he ends up in jail, and I remember this wonderful day where I realized that Sharansky, who kind of comes into the story much later, is next in the cell next to him. And I was like, brilliant. Like now, like this guy takes me from the start of the book, I can link up with Sharansky, and then, I knew I wanted to end in this very big march that happened in '87 in Washington, where it was the first time Gorbachev came to visit the US, and there was 250,000 people out, and it was like the apogee of the movement. Mendelevich is finally freed, and he shows up at this rally. So, and that's just one person, but there was like a few characters.
I was also there.
You were there too. But were you in Riga in 1963?
No, I was
not. So that's so it was structuring the book was a lot of kind of figuring out who are going to be the people who a reader can kind of follow along. And you're asking people books that we look to, and one of the ones that I looked at a lot of books about movements, because and the one book that I really tried to emulate was Taylor Branch wrote this amazing trilogy, which is ostensibly a biography of Martin Luther King, but it's not really. It's a biography of the civil rights movement. Adam Hochschild is another writer who does this really well, which he takes like a movement, but really humanizes it, personalizes it, and that's really the only way to do it and to make it actually interesting for people to read.
Are there any books you guys are reading now that you'd recommend other than The Golden Notebook, Boris or Gal?
I'm partly rereading and partly reading for the first time the collected stories of Flannery O'Connor, and she's phenomenal. And I wanted to add one more person to my greatest hits list, which is Graham Greene. There are 2 books of his that I think are among the best I've ever read, which are The Comedians and The Heart of the Matter. If you're looking for a book to read, either of those would make, I think, a phenomenal choice.
There's this 800-page biography of Stalin's daughter.
Lest you think we're going to end on a chill note, I would be remiss if I didn't kind of mention the fact that freedom of speech, and especially attacks on journalists and writers and cartoonists, is really at the forefront of my mind, and I'm sure the forefront of many of your minds, especially after the attack on Charlie Hebdo in Paris. And I'm just wondering if, as writers and as Jews and as Russians, and some of your parents are survivors of a totalitarian empire, do you feel obligated to what role do you see for yourself in kind of the politics, or Lionel Trilling called it, the bloody crossroads where politics and literature meet, if you see yourself there at all? To end on a light note, Yelena?
That's this is hard because I feel, I'm sort of embarrassed that I have a little bit of an allergy to politics. That is, I know it's not good. It's not good, but I have it. I guess I take for granted all of the freedoms that I have, and I just don't. I read the news, obviously. Well, not obviously. Sometimes I go for a month without reading the news, but I don't. I think that I'm unfortunately so much living in my own universe, to say, that I don't. I'm not politically active. I'll vote, but I don't have that belief. Like, I don't fight for things. I don't go to rallies. I don't. When it was at Zuccotti Park, I passed by once.
You're talking about Occupy Wall Street?
Occupy Wall Street. I'm not very politically minded. It's too individual.
I feel like one has to beware of playing the Soviet card. In my case, I was a Soviet citizen, so I know what repression is like. I don't. I left when I was 9 years old, and I was aggressively sheltered from it by my parents. So that card has to be played sparingly. Another thing that might surprise you is, by virtue of having come from that place, I have a higher tolerance for big government than people in America. And while I do respect the idea of unfettered free speech, I think it's bananas. And when I look at cartoons of, let's say, Ariel Sharon drinking the blood of Palestinian babies, I think those cartoons do achieve the goal of practicing unfettered free speech. And if that, narrowly defined, is the goal, it's achieved, and it deserves to be protected. But what, in practical terms, that cartoon has done is turned this viewer, who until that moment was relatively sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, it has moved me aggressively to the Israeli side of the argument. So in trying to express a profound truth about Palestinian suffering, it has achieved the opposite of its aims, at least with this viewer. And for me, that fact needs to be taken into account when we consider the value of that kind of cultural production.
Gal?
I don't know. I'm not sure I have too much more to add. I think that no. I think I don't know, because all of this is obviously with the shadow of these conversations about Charlie Hebdo kind of hovering over
absolutely.
us. And I mean, I make a distinction, as a lot of people who have written about this do, between speech that targets a people as a people, hate speech that incites against people, against a group of people, and speech that is seen to take on an idea. And I give a great amount of latitude to the kind of speech that, frankly, people have kind of characterized Charlie Hebdo as doing, as attacking and ridiculing and mocking ideas. And so that's kind of just a line that I draw for myself. I mean, I think that the example of the Ariel Sharon cartoon, I mean, that could be seen as something that, could provoke people to actually attack Jews as Jews, because it's seen as being, them kind of drinking blood. You know, that there is kind of that is hate speech to me. But there's a lot of
And
things
yet,
that.
right,
Yeah.
and yet attacking the idea is, you know, there was a Charlie Hebdo, and I know we need to end, cover where there was, they were sending up the idea of circumcision.
Yeah.
And they put, you know, a very Der Stürmer-looking Jew on the cover of the magazine. And, you know, some could say, is that attacking Jews? No, it's attacking Judaism and circumcision, the idea.
We at the Forward, we made this decision right in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attacks to run the cartoons in our paper that were the ones attacking Judaism. One of the guys who was killed, can't remember exactly his name, but he had done like his version of the Ten Commandments, or not the Ten Commandments, all 613 mitzvot, right? But he just like was just unsparingly mocking. I mean, he had, you know, do not kill was like an Israeli soldier killing a Palestinian woman. You know, it was, but we ran that in our paper as in order to just, you know, stand behind the principle that we thought that kind of speech should be able to be out there.
I just want to say two things quickly. Having said what I said, I do have to acknowledge that I don't think it's possible to police and regulate free speech unless you have a Soviet-style totalitarian government. So it just has to be unfettered. But the second thing that I wanted to say was, further on this issue of effectiveness, I was thinking about it this way. Imagine you're trying to persuade, and the response can be, well, it's not a cartoonist's responsibility to persuade, and if so, ignore what I'm saying. But let's say you want to make people in Idaho change their views on gay marriage. Which cartoon is likely to be more effective? One that shows the governor kissing a man, or one where you have a gay couple watching TV in the evening with a clicker and big wedding bands on their fingers, and they say, "We fought for this"?
One's a much more provocative and interesting cartoon, I think, a matter of style,
And
which
one
is the first one.
And one is far more effective in changing the way conservative people in Idaho think about gays.
We can continue this conversation with the writers after you buy their books, which will happen over there to the left. But please give them a round of applause.